The one thing that you need to remember about presidential primary elections is... Hey there, this is Patrick, and welcome back to the channel where we simplify things. Today we're going to be looking at presidential primary elections, how they work, and how you might be able to predict them as we look forward to this year's election in 2024. Fun fact, I've actually worked with political campaigns for the last 12 years, and here's a fun picture of an event I planned with Secret Service a few years back. Now, in most elections and most candidates I work with, it's pretty straightforward. You have an election, a general election in November, it's on the same day, there's a time frame for voting, but it's generally the same day and you're preparing for that one election. Presidential primary elections are way different. You have elections that span all the way from January through June. They have different rules, they have different times, sometimes they even have different days. They're not all on Tuesdays. You have to look at these elections a little bit differently than you would a standard election. To make things even more complicated when you look at presidential elections, there's also these things called caucuses, which are even weirder. You don't just go into a voting booth and vote for your candidate. Caucuses are typically held by the parties themselves, the state parties themselves, where you get into a room with other people of that same party, you work together, you decide who you want to support with those other people. And based on how many people you have, that determines how many delegates you get, which is who actually goes and votes at the convention. Because the way this works is you're not actually voting for a candidate. You're voting for a delegate who says they're going to go vote for the candidate at the convention later this summer. It's really confusing. It's not what most people think, where they're voting for a candidate like you would in a general election. You're voting for this delegate who is then voting for the candidate, and the delegate can technically make their own decisions. And it's very weird. It's very strange, and it makes presidential primary elections extremely unique. Well, there's a lot that goes into presidential primary elections. The one thing that you need to remember about presidential primary elections is that momentum is everything. In this case with momentum, we're referring to something that starts in motion and keeps moving faster and faster and is unlikely to stop once it starts. And momentum in the case of a presidential primary election like this one, we're talking about the fact that the results from an early state impact the future results. What a candidate gets in the first state impacts their polling results and eventually their election results in the second state, in the third state, and the fourth state. When you're looking at a presidential primary election, you can't necessarily look at the national results and the national polling because it's very misleading. Those will change extremely quickly as time goes on and results actually come in. It seems kind of weird, but voters really want to vote for candidates who are winners. If they see somebody's performing better in one state, that makes them more likely to vote for them in the next state. However, if they perform poorly in one state, it makes them less likely to vote for them in another state. Let's look at an example. The 2020 Democratic primary is a really good example because you can see very early on how in Iowa, for example, Joe Biden underperformed pretty significantly while candidates like Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar overperformed, and that directly impacted the results in future states. The immediate aftermath of Iowa was pretty stark in the poll results. Immediately after that election, you could go and you could see Joe Biden going from 20 to 25% in New Hampshire polling to only 10 to 15%. Now, Pete Buttigieg flipped. Pete Buttigieg went from 10 to 15% to 20 to 25%. So their results were directly impacted by Iowa, and that not only impacted the poll results, but also impacted the actual election results only a week later. In the months leading up to the New Hampshire primary, Joe Biden was polling in first place or second place the majority of the time, yet he ended up finishing fifth place in New Hampshire when all was said and done. Many other candidates who were polling sixth place, seventh place, way down the line, they actually ended up finishing in the top few because of the reaction to Iowa. It's not just about performing well, it's also performing compared to expectations. If a candidate is expected to perform at 12% and they perform at 16%, that looks good. That generally has positive results. But if it's the reverse and they're expected to get 17% and they only get 13%, that's a lot more problematic. You can see the example of momentum even more so as you look to the rest of the primary. As the primary cycle went on, you could see Bernie Sanders gaining more momentum, and a lot of people thought Joe Biden could potentially lose. He really was on a track to lose to Bernie Sanders until right before Super Tuesday and right after Super Tuesday, all of his competitors dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden. That was the momentum shift that Biden needed to get over the fact that his performance was not as good as the polling or the expectations coming in. Once his competitors came in and they dropped out and endorsed him, that shifted the momentum and gave him the momentum that he needed to win the primary election. This same momentum can be seen in 2016, the Republican primary. Donald Trump was the favorite coming in once the elections actually started. However, there was still a chance for other candidates to compete with him. Ted Cruz had a little bit of momentum out of Iowa, and Marco Rubio had this 3-2-1 strategy, which was third place in Iowa, second place in New Hampshire, and first place in South Carolina. That strategy looked like it might come to fruition until Chris Christie completely took him down in a debate performance prior to the New Hampshire election, and that led Rubio to underperform what he was expected to in both New Hampshire and in South Carolina, which ultimately ended the contest and did not lead to a prolonged election cycle. This example of momentum where Rubio lost momentum and Trump continued to pick up momentum is another good example of how even in a fractured field, one candidate can emerge and can take a huge advantage even when it looks like it might be a little more contested early on. Now that we've learned about momentum, let's look towards the 2024 election cycle. Joe Biden has an overwhelming lead that you would expect from an incumbent, and none of his challengers really seem like they're going to put up any type of real competition. So I think you can kind of look past that election and assume Joe Biden is probably going to win without any sort of contest. Donald Trump also has a commanding lead and is expected to be the nominee. Unless something pretty dramatic happens, it's unlikely that anyone is going to seriously contest him. However, he does have a few well-known and well-funded competitors. Former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis are both well-funded and have good name ID. They're going to be the candidates to watch to see if anything might shift in how this Republican primary turns out. As I mentioned before, early state momentum is everything. As a result, we really should look to Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina polling, see how things might shake out, and make some predictions on how this election cycle might go. In Iowa, Trump leads with a 51% polling advantage to DeSantis' 19% and Haley's 16%. In New Hampshire, Trump leads with a 46% polling average to Haley's 25% and DeSantis' 10%. In South Carolina, Trump leads with a 49% polling average to Haley's 20% and DeSantis' 11%. DeSantis and Haley are taking very different paths to try to gain momentum. DeSantis is putting all of his weight into Iowa. He believes that if he performs pretty well in Iowa and can show a gap between himself and Haley and not as big of a gap between himself and Trump, that overperformance will help drive him to better performances in New Hampshire and in South Carolina. So he is hedging most of his bet on performing well in Iowa, with a similar kind of path that Ted Cruz and a few other candidates have tried in the past, and has helped generate momentum for other candidates in the past. If DeSantis does not perform well in Iowa, it's unlikely that he's going to continue very long into the election cycle, because if he doesn't perform well in Iowa, then you have New Hampshire, then you have South Carolina. It's likely that Haley will beat him in both states. And as you look forward to Super Tuesday and beyond, it's highly unlikely that DeSantis would last until Florida unless he thought he could win Florida. Most candidates do not want to be embarrassed in their home state, especially a state that DeSantis just won by 20 plus points in the general election in 2022. So it is likely that unless DeSantis believes he will win Florida, he will most likely drop out before then, and potentially well before then if his financials, his fundraising doesn't look good, and if he's not performing well. Haley's banking on a very similar strategy to DeSantis, only her entire focus is on New Hampshire. She believes that if she can finish a strong second in New Hampshire close to Trump, that could give her enough momentum to win South Carolina, which is her home state. And if she wins South Carolina, that could potentially drive her to better results in Super Tuesday if she's seen as a legitimate Trump alternative. Now, that's still a long shot strategy. Realistically, Trump is expected to win all three early states, and if he does so by commanding margins, he's likely to win the election. And it is also the case where Haley needs to perform extremely well in New Hampshire, or she's unlikely to stay in through South Carolina and beyond, because she, again, just like DeSantis, does not want to lose in her home state by a wide margin. Now, she is not the current governor, so it would be less problematic if she didn't necessarily win. But if she can't win in South Carolina in her home state, where else can she win? So it is also likely that if she doesn't have a really good performance in New Hampshire and then South Carolina, she also will most likely not last through the election cycle very long. If you're looking to predict the election yourself, you should consider two distinct factors when looking to predict an election. The first one is polling results. So what are the most recent polling results in the state coming up? And the second is Google Trend results. What are people searching for? How likely is it that somebody's looking for that candidate on Google? If you look to Iowa and get a feel for how this works, in Iowa, Donald Trump is not only dominating the poll results, he's also dominating the Google search results. This is important because it shows intent and it shows the interest that somebody might have in a candidate. For example, if towards election day, you see this huge kind of spike in support for DeSantis, that means Ron DeSantis is very likely going to outperform his polling support. If you see Donald Trump continue to dominate the search results and continue to perform exceptionally well, and no candidate gets close to him, then he's likely to match his poll results and win by a huge margin. If we look to the current Google search trends, you can see that Haley has actually been generating more interest than DeSantis, despite DeSantis leading in the polling. This can change as we get closer to election day. However, if I were to make a prediction right now, based on this Google search results, I would suggest that Donald Trump will probably win 55%, Haley will win 20%, and DeSantis would win 18%, with the other candidates receiving the rest. In the Google search results, you can see shift my thinking in how I look at the poll results and then I look at the election results. Because Trump has a huge advantage in both, I would still expect him to win by a huge advantage. However, how it shakes out for the other candidates is going to shift a little bit, because you can see that right now anyway, the voters are more interested in Haley than in DeSantis. In the New Hampshire primary, you can see the results are very similar. However, there's a much closer gap between Haley and Trump in the Google Trends results, which is the same thing that we're seeing in the poll results. While Iowa has this pretty huge gap, New Hampshire is a lot tighter, depending on which poll that you're looking at. So for that reason, I would expect Haley to perform more closely to Trump and there to be a bigger gap between her and the other candidates. Well, you might look at all this and think it's voodoo math or it's making too many assumptions. I assure you it's not. And you can actually look to past election results to confirm that this guessing game, right, and this kind of prediction game makes a lot of sense when you look at the poll results and the Google Trend results. Remember how I discussed the New Hampshire 2020 Democratic primary results? That election is a great example of how polling and Google Trends combined can allow you to predict accurately a primary election. In New Hampshire, the final polling showed Bernie Sanders at 29%, Pete Buttigieg at 21%, Klobuchar at 12%, Warren at 11%, and Biden at 11%. In the final results, Bernie dropped from 29 to 26, Buttigieg increased from 21 to 24, Klobuchar increased from 12 to 20, Warren went down from 11 to 9, and Biden went down from 11 to 8. My prediction, I had Bernie at 29, Buttigieg at 25, Klobuchar at 16, Warren at 12, and Biden at 11. So while the polling showed Klobuchar a very distant third place and tied with Warren and Biden, I showed Klobuchar higher by a good margin than Warren and Biden, and I also had Buttigieg exactly at the number that he received in the election. What you can see here, the reason I was able to make that prediction is I looked at the Google search trends, and you can see this Facebook post I made from February 10th, 2020, that outlined this exact prediction. And you can see in the Google Trends here, Pete Buttigieg was getting an outsized interest in Google search over the last week prior to the primary, and Bernie Sanders was getting that as well. And there was a gap between Klobuchar, Biden, and Warren. If you follow this Google Trends gap, you can see how this search trends shifted over time. And you can see how right up to election day that there was a huge gap between the top three of Buttigieg, Sanders, and Klobuchar and the rest of the field. In summary, I do expect Joe Biden and Donald Trump to win their primary elections handily. They have huge advantages, both being pseudo-incumbents, with Biden being an incumbent, Trump being a pseudo-incumbent, and they both raised a lot of money and have had a ton of competitors to this point to the level of themselves. Donald Trump is quite popular in the Republican primary electorate, and Joe Biden has not generated a serious challenger in response. However, I would keep an eye on Iowa and New Hampshire. If Donald Trump shows any weakness in either of those states, it's possible that this could become a prolonged primary. Most likely, it would be Nikki Haley in New Hampshire that would create this problem for him, but it's possible. There's still a lot of time left, and there's a lot of things that could happen. And it's important to watch those and then look at the Google search trends and look at the polling and see if you're seeing these movements and make these predictions on your own as you look through those results. So thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more videos, you can click up here and see my most recent video. If you found this helpful or interesting, please like this video and please subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you on the next one.